All right, welcome. This is the penultimate session of today's Suncast Clean Energy Summit, which is day 3 of our 3-week journey. I'm so glad that you're joining us. Frankly, I'm glad to be back in English for our last English session of the day. I speak Spanish all right, but it's been taxing. So I'm grateful that you're joining us, and we're going to have a phenomenal conversation here about island resiliency as we talk about how climate change and clean energy coincide, how the islands themselves have various points of interest and discussion around the topic of resilience, economic, energy, as well as many other interesting topics therein. We're going to be joined by some of the market's foremost experts on energy, climate change, and island economics. The moderator of today's panel is James Elsmore. I'll discuss more about James' background in just a moment. If you are just jumping in here and you're on Facebook or LinkedIn, YouTube or Twitter, or if you're on Crowdcast even, will you let us know that you're watching live by just hitting live? Put that in the comments section. I'm live. And then if you're watching us in the replay, will you put replay in the comments section? We would like to know how folks are viewing the session. We encourage you, after you've now found and gotten comfortable with the comments section, to drop questions there from time to time. We'd like to make this more interactive with today's panel. We have an exciting opportunity here to learn from folks who have real deep experience in the island economies. First, I'd like to take a moment to thank our main sponsor, SunGrow, one of the largest manufacturers and well-known manufacturers of inverters in the world, leading the clean energy revolution at the point of common coupling. We also want to thank ZN Shine, who is our track sponsor, one of the Tier 1 solar panel manufacturers who has come alongside us to help make this and every other session today and all of our other 2 days free for you, so that you can be here investing the one thing that is not renewable, and that is your time. We're grateful for all the companies that you see represented here who have also collaborated to help make this a free event for you and for me. Who am I? I'm Nico Johnson. I am the host and founder of Suncast, the podcast, as well as the media company that produces and presents Suncast, and now many of our live events like this one. This is our inaugural Suncast Clean Energy Summit. We've been having a lot of fun over the last 2 weeks, bringing a lot of folks who are past guests of the Suncast podcast, but also who are leaders in their respective market or domain expertise, and inviting you all as an audience to interact with us in this moment where we all find ourselves socially distanced and unable to go to conferences, unable to interact in person in public, and to meet and be in the trade show environment, be in the conference hall environment where we can continue learning. Here in the summit, we are adding to your capacity by bringing you some of the leading thought leaders in the industry. One such individual who I've had the great pleasure of getting to know over the years is Mr. James Elsmore. James is the director and founder of the Island Innovation. Island Innovation is a social enterprise bringing together islands around the world to collaborate on sustainable development. James, so good to see you, man.
Hey, Nico. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, James is also a world traveler, having spent a lot of time in Latin America, recently retreating back to the UK, which is probably for the best. We've stuck it out here in Mexico. I think we'll be here for a little while longer, but I can tell you, you're one of the few people I've been jealous of recently, as I've thought, should we be going home? How are things in the UK?
It was an interesting evacuation flight, and this is my makeshift quarantine room where I'm staying for 2 weeks. So it's good, but it was time to get home when they said it might be the last flight until September.
Wow, yeah. Well, if we see one of those, I can guarantee you I'll be saying goodbye to our friends here in Mexico and heading back to North Carolina. So for those of you who are probably familiar with James, he's had millions of views and readers for his articles in Forbes. He also launched, in advance of our Suncast Summit, the Innovative Island Innovation Summit last fall, which also received hundreds, if I'm not mistaken, perhaps thousands of attendees, highlighting exactly what we're going to talk about today: the Caribbean market as an island market is one of your domain areas of expertise as someone who has studied and has, in fact, a higher education degree on island economics. You know, a lot of these islands have been crushed in their strength thanks to COVID-19, and that is tourism. There's a massive red light in energy usage, right? Energy declining. We saw in our keynote that energy is declining across the board, not only globally, but here in Latin America, especially as we see most of the hotels turning off the lights and saying goodbye to their visitors for a while. What we want to talk about today is how is resiliency being conceptualized and integrated into the inevitable rebuilding of these economies and these island nations. How's the role of climate change affecting the dynamic amongst these small island developing states, SIDS as they're called? So I want to turn the floor over to you, James. You have a distinguished panel that you want to bring on. I'm going to get myself out of the way and let you take over. Thank you so much, James, for being the expert on the floor here, and the floor is yours.
Awesome, Nico. Well, thanks for having me, and hello to everyone tuning in from all around the world. If you want to drop in a comment with who you are, where you're calling from, it would be great to have an idea of who is joining and watching us. And feel free to drop in questions throughout. So we'll make sure we will comment on them. Really, today will just be a casual discussion with different angles and a comparative look at the Caribbean market to contrast that with the larger markets in Latin America that you've been talking about throughout today. Our speakers are coming from three quite different regions. I think it's important to note often the Caribbean is described as a monolith, both culturally and economically, but it's not at all. The region is so diverse, despite its small population. And so we'll be having first Azelle Francis from Trinidad and Tobago, who's a PhD student in Atlanta. We'll have Dagmara Avanindra, who's an engineer based in Aruba, and then Gabi Perez, based in Puerto Rico. So we'll be going to the English-speaking CARICOM countries, to the Dutch Caribbean, and then to Puerto Rico. So three quite different markets where we can do a comparative look at what is happening in each of those. So we'd love your comments, love your questions. I think one of the interesting things about this market, given the current crisis that we're in, is that it is a very tourism-dependent economy. And actually, we have two extremes here, with Trinidad and Tobago probably one of the least tourism-dependent economies in the region, right up to Aruba, which is known to be, I think, 95% of the economy, or around over 90% of the economy, is dependent on tourism. And clearly that's going to have a knock-on effect on these economies, which will also impact the energy industry as a whole in the long term. It's difficult to make any predictions right now in terms of how long this will last and how long this crisis will go until we return to normal. So yeah, please send in your questions, and we'll first go to Trinidad. Azelle, if you're here and want to join us, just tell us a little bit about the research that you're doing, the different economies in the Eastern Caribbean, and what you see as kind of some interesting trends happening there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here today. It's been quite interesting to observe, because typically whenever you think about Latin America and the Caribbean, you think about Latin America for the most part. A lot of the research that you see specifically looking at energy and sustainable development tends to focus heavily on the Latin American aspect of the Latin American and Caribbean region. For me, so my PhD is actually going to be in International Affairs, Science and Technology from Georgia Institute of Technology. And my background is in mechanical engineering. So I was particularly interested in seeing how us as islands, specifically looking at the Caribbean, can utilize energy in a manner that would advance our sustainable development. What has been interesting as I've progressed in my research is noting that big difference. So yes, we have just over 90% of our region is highly fossil fuel dependent and also highly tourism based. So then when you do have these studies, for example, RMI did a study looking at the transition from fossil fuel-based economies to renewable energy economies, you see a lot of talk about economies of scale. You see that renewable energy makes sense for the Caribbean. But then you pull back and you think about the outlier of Trinidad and Tobago. So Trinidad, being a fossil fuel exporter, actually has a very different lens through which you look at this idea of transition and green transition. But if you think about islands and how that transition can happen, you also actually have Iceland as a great example of a country that has done a transition, a green transition, being a fossil fuel exporter independent country. So.
And maybe just as another interesting market, maybe just 30 seconds you could tell us about. Guyana has been in the news a lot recently for its oil and is kind of potentially following the path of Trinidad. Again, one of the few economies that has an almost insignificant tourism industry. But also that this discovery of oil and the huge influx, people are saying potentially more oil per capita than Saudi Arabia. That could also impact the renewable energy. So just tell us quickly about Guyana as well, because people might have heard about that recently.
Yeah, so I think that the big challenge is not the finding of oil or the idea that you utilize a oil-based economy, because I do think that you can use the revenue from your oil-based economy to help you transition, right? But it's more so about the idea that we have to avoid this dependency on one resource, be it for Guyana and Trinidad, this oil. We need to also look at it from like the other islands where they're super dependent on tourism. So we need to be sure that we're thinking about a diversification of our economies broadly as a region, and utilizing our current markets and schemes to be able to do so.
Fantastic. Well, we'll come back to you in a second, Azelle, but next I want to travel a little bit further west to Aruba. Dagmara is been based in Aruba for several years now and has also worked in Curacao and Bonaire and other islands as well. So how does the situation, I guess, in the Eastern Caribbean contrast with what's happening in the ABC Islands, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, which are Dutch territories in the region?
Yes, hi James, thank you for having me on. So even within the Dutch Caribbean, there's a huge variation between the islands. There are 6 Dutch Caribbean islands, of course, the ABC Islands, Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao, and then there's Saba, Statia, and St. Martin. Out of the 6, Aruba is by far the hardest hit for 2 reasons. Aruba is the most dependent on the tourism sector, probably in the Caribbean overall. In fact, Standard & Poor's rated Aruba as to be one of the hardest hit countries in the world by COVID-19 because of the economic implication of lack of tourism. So not just Caribbean, but one of the hardest hit countries in the world. You were exactly right that close to 90% of Aruba economy depends on tourism. Aruba has tried to diversify its streams of income for the last 10 years, though so far unsuccessfully. And also, besides being dependent heavily on tourism, Aruba is the most independent country in the Dutch Kingdom. That means it manages its own budget compared to Bonaire is a province of Holland, Saba and Statia, province of Holland. So those islands are actually not like Bonaire, Statia, and Saba are going to be affected minimally compared to other Dutch Caribbean islands because they have automatic flow going, aid going from the Dutch government, just like as if they were geographically positioned in Europe. So about 40 to 50% of load in Aruba came from hotels. So now that's all gone. It is very scary. The COVID cases are under control in Aruba. The peak was at 100. Now, as of yesterday, there were 18. So Aruba is free and clear that way. However, opening borders is not going to be happening soon. At least that is what Prime Minister said the other day, because Aruba has only 12 ICU beds. And if something goes wrong, it will go wrong there really quickly. So my biggest concern out of the all Dutch Caribbean islands is for Aruba. Curacao has financial sector and shipping sector. Also, even though it is not a province of Holland, Holland manages its budget, so the aid is more automatic. With all that said, Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao has been all moving forward towards high renewable penetration. Aruba has been doing it more publicly. Curacao has been doing it more sort of stealthily, not so much talking about it, but just kind of executing, because they've gone through so many changes of the governments in the last 8 years. However, despite of that, they've been able to increase their renewable penetration with wind and solar very significantly. So all the ABC islands have really fantastic constant wind, and those islands have been positioned to capitalize on it. And until very recently, all of the islands, actually particularly Curacao and Bonaire, have had expansion plans for more renewable, because Bonaire has been growing really fast. And right now, in the month of April, the load has fell to the level of 2016. So going to 4 years ago, and they've been growing 10 to 15% a year load-wise.
Okay, very interesting. I know there's other implications for this. I mean, I was thinking, for example, it's very common for people in Aruba and Curacao to go to Colombia for healthcare treatment for other issues, and so these border challenges are going to have a huge impact on people living on the island as well, in terms of their access to things like healthcare. Am I right in thinking then that Aruba and Curacao probably have the highest renewable penetration in the region as a percentage?
Bonaire, I'm
Definitely up
going to say
there.
Bonaire.
Okay. Yeah, I know all three are up there, and if you've ever been to those islands, you'll know that there is that strong, consistent wind on the north side of all three islands that makes wind there have a huge potential that you don't have to the same extent in other places like the Eastern Caribbean.
And actually,
also,
sorry, I'm going to correct myself as an answer to your question. Actually, Sabah and Statia have the highest renewable percentage of penetration, because they're small, and
Right.
they were able recently in the last couple of years install those solar and storage projects fully paid by the Netherlands, and so actually they have the highest renewable penetration.
Right. Sabre has that big battery system that allows it to get up there, but with a small population.
Yeah.
Right,
Exactly.
right. But with small populations, obviously easier to do, and probably would be difficult to do such a large battery project affordably.
Correct.
in Aruba and Curacao. And there's a link as well. Just we were mentioning oil in Trinidad and Guyana, and there's a historic link between those countries, or particularly Trinidad and Aruba and Curacao, with the refineries. Now, the refinery in Aruba is no longer open, right? But the one in Curacao is still in process?
Also closed. No, it is closed within last year, which has created a huge economic crisis. A refinery was owned by Venezuela. And so there are a lot of economic implications, because Curacao also has a fuel distributing company called Curoil. So they're a trader so their supply was affected. And Curacao has been in the jam as well a little bit for the last actually year and a half now, a little bit longer than the rest of us.
Interesting. Yeah, I know the economy in Curacao has been struggling. Well, we'll introduce our third speaker, Gabi Perez, if he can join us, tell us a little bit about what's happening in Puerto Rico. Obviously, I'm sure many of you watching will know some of what's been happening in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria and the crisis that the utility companies being in. But Gabi, you're very involved on multiple levels, kind of looking towards building a more resilient economy and resilient energy system for Puerto Rico. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, James, here, and great to be part of this excellent panel. So yes, here in Puerto Rico, as everybody already knows, we have been having some tough years, with Hurricane Maria, almost 3 years now. Earthquakes happening since January. Recently, we had one 5.5 last Saturday, so the island's still shaking. Then you add the economic crisis and the new government that we had last year during this time, and of course COVID-19. So as everybody has been explaining here, we have been having that same issues. I think probably in a bigger sense, but bad things, good things happen. So I think the island mentality has changed. I think we have a resilient mentality. It was very tough to be on our homes, and it's tough, but I think we're gonna get through this. Currently, we have seen the battery industry growing here in Puerto Rico around 90 megawatts in GD, megawatts of storage installed in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. So this is more on residential and critical facilities. Also, the important thing here is the engagement of the non-for-profits in the rebuilding of the island. They have been super important supporting us, like Rocky Mountain, Direct Relief, Red Cross, and also local non-for-profits. So they have been the pillar for us and on this movement.
And how is the coronavirus situation in Puerto Rico? Was lockdown being able to be implemented in time for, I guess, to stop the spread? And also, maybe you could just comment about the implication on the tourism industry. I know that tourism in Puerto Rico is important, not as important as Aruba, but what's that looking like?
Yeah, no, tourism is super important here. Manufacturing, I think, it's the first industry here in Puerto Rico. But yeah, of course, there's no tourism. We started the lockdown March 15, and we were not able to even go out for a walk. So it was a complete lockdown, just going to supermarket and pharmacy. But that was just taking care on May. Last Monday it was open. They're starting to open new business solar projects. They could start installing new projects. Before it was just critical facilities doing maintenance. So pretty much was completely stopped, the economy here in Puerto Rico. So we have been tough, but now we're seeing some movement.
And we've actually got a question in specifically about Puerto Rico already. So Manuel has asked, we've seen an interesting transition in Puerto Rico since the hurricane with more battery backup in solar systems. I think he's particularly mentioning domestic systems, which I know is very popular in Puerto Rico. What kind of evolution can we expect in the region? And maybe you can comment on Puerto Rico in terms of that adaptation. And I'm really interested in this because there's been a huge trend in Puerto Rico, particularly for those that can afford it, to kind of go off grid or have battery backup systems. And the reasons for that are not always purely financial. It's there's many reasons. So maybe Gabi, you can just comment on that a little bit.
Oh, of course. Here in Puerto Rico, or like I mentioned before, it was more just grid-tied systems. Now battery storage is coming to place. People are more cautious. Before we were just, let's save energy, let's save some money. Now, it's like, if we want solar, let's add batteries. It's just not like just solar. So I think Puerto Rico it has become like a laboratory for batteries. We have all brands here. We know which one works better in different temperature, in climates, in cycle counts. So we have been getting to get to an expert in this topic. Also, in general sense, with Act 17 signed last year for Puerto Rico moving for 100% renewable energy, that has pushed the Energy Bureau to start working on the wheeling process, a new interconnection agreement, new microgrid agreements. So you're going to start seeing a lot of movement, also adding other opportunities, other funding, like opportunity funding from the US and CDBG from the reconstruction. So when you add all these programs, I see that there's a lot of potential in the island.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to remind everyone who is watching, please send in your questions for any of our panelists, or general questions for all of them. Or if you have any points or comments on what's being said, please add those and we'll read them out also. Dagmara and Azel, I'm wondering if either of you have any comments about distributed generation trends on other islands. I think Puerto Rico has been particularly strong because there's this kind of political push and people really wanting to be independent. Perhaps some of that is due to a lack of trust in the utility and the government as well. One interesting example, I'm not sure if it's been seen elsewhere, I know in Curacao, there was a sun tax, it was called, for a while. I'm not sure the status of that was actually discouraging people from the utilities perspective, discouraging people from installing solar and distributed generation. So do either of you have any comments on DG?
Sure. So specifically to talk to your Curacao example, Curacao has gone through a number of iterations and sort of swung from one extreme to another with distributed generation. Has to do with politics, is always on the island. With politics aside, basically there was a time and point that anybody could install solar and sell, there was no limit, and sell at the same rate as the utility collector would charge them. Now, there was no control as to where those installations were happening. So as far as microgrid control, nothing was happening. So one area could get richer area, of course, would get more solar. So that would produce more grid instability. Second of all, the revenue of a collector started to fall uncontrollably. And Curacao was one of the first islands where distributed generation was being developed very aggressively because of favorable tariff rates of buyback. And that was also a learning experience. One of the reasons it was so is because there was at that time, no knowledge, no data, and no realization what does it mean for grid stability. So then the pendulum swung back. So there were a couple of years ago, there were still a number of applications that were approved for solar installation. And those applications were submitted while the buyback rate was the same as the sell rate. Now that was cut severely, and I have to say that had to be done because a collector had no way of sustaining itself otherwise. A collector had to already replace a lot of old fossil generation because the country was in a state of a crisis. It basically had no credit. They could not borrow from anybody. No bank would borrow. And so a collector had to be very creative. This is my personal observations and not the statements from a collector, but they basically had to stop paying their bills in order to put some new artillas in because there was no cash coming from nowhere. The government had no money. No bank was going to support them. And then with the renewables being installed uncontrollably and the revenues falling drastically, that was a no-go. So they had to make a lot of hard choices, which I actually applaud them for. So now there are people who are installing distributed generation, but now it's much more moderate. Now on Aruba, I think has learned from that. There was never a very wild DG kind of proliferation. But people apply for permits, and you see quite a bit of solar in better-to-do areas of Aruba, and Aruba's income levels are pretty decent. So there's about 10 megawatts of solar installed, and until the crisis, the average load was 110 on the island, 110 megawatts. So pretty decent amount, and more to spread gradually. As far as Bonaire, Ceiba, and Statia, well, Bonaire has, I guess, population where there's some like a very wealthy percentage, and then there's like a more population with less income. So the people with less income, they're not even thinking about distributed generation. Otherwise, Bonaire, I feel in itself, Bonaire has an IPP that is responsible for 100% of its generation. The IPP is very sustainability minded, and they've been operated very admirably in 4 years. In the last 4 years, there were no blackouts or brownouts on the island, and that's with increasing renewables and storage. And they were able to do all that while dropping the tariffs for the customers, which is pretty amazing. So there's not so much motivation for that. Saba and Statia, well, basically the Netherlands came and installed their solar storage for everybody. So there's not so much drive for that.
Right, and I think it's really worth mentioning, although it varies, all of the Dutch territories to some extent have a level of EU or Dutch funding. I know in Aruba and Curacao it's much lower than the other islands.
Particularly Aruba, yes.
Yeah, Aruba has the least amount, and particularly for the 3 smaller islands that you mentioned, EU funding is a good option in some of these, exactly, beyond energy as well, but for development projects. Azelle, any comments about distributed generation? Because I think here, you've looking a lot at the Eastern Caribbean region, and it's worth mentioning that you've got a lot of very small jurisdictions with 50,000. Some of them in Anguilla's, I think 10,000 people. St. Lucia 200,000, and even though they might be separated by a few miles of ocean, the situation can be drastically different from one island to the next according to policy. I mean, even the utility structures are quite different on each island. So, are there any good examples that you would like to mention?
Collectively, for the region, you've seen a lot of interest in DG, but you haven't seen much larger projects than these small pilot projects that are kind of random across different islands. Given the fact that it makes economic sense because those islands tend to have some of the highest electricity rates across the region, especially in the Eastern Caribbean, and the fact that distributed generation can also enhance their climate resiliency, as we've seen so much more extreme hurricanes within the Caribbean. It's kind of underwhelming when you look at how many large-scale projects specifically within those islands. But one of the good ones that I would highlight would be that you've seen like the Inter-American Development Bank offer a lot of financing now, which is one of the biggest barriers that countries tend to cite for why distributed generation has not taken more on stream. So as more financing becomes available to the region, I think that will help. But also I think that we need to have more political will from our leaders, because our policies tend to be a bit outdated in regards to allowing distributed generation to occur. So though the interest is there, there's this idea of a missing political will or not as strong political will and finance.
And you mentioned this idea around climate resilience, and I think for those of us working in the Caribbean, that's kind of a word that comes up every other sentence almost. We're talking about resilience and this, but perhaps people who are working outside the region in other parts of Latin America will be less familiar with kind of the motivations behind that drive and why that is seen as so fundamentally important. I mean, we have one great example of why it's important with Puerto Rico, another one with Dominica in the Eastern Caribbean. Any general comments about what you're seeing with trends towards climate resilience and the importance of that? And then in addition to that, I also wanted just you to quickly comment. I know you're frequently looking for data on what's happening in the region, and I think it's really interesting if you just share your kind of experiences looking for data about what's happening in the region.
Awesome. So one of the big, I guess, trends is this idea that for the Caribbean, it's not just what we do now. And climate change is not something that is a future prospect for us, or the effects, rather, of climate change is not something that is a futuristic thought, but rather these are effects that we have seen and that we continue to see and that we can predict with more certainty that will continue to increase. So when you think about climate resilience, you think about how do countries recover after natural disaster, be it we're talking about hurricanes, or if we're talking about a pandemic like COVID-19. It's things that you cannot predict, but that you need to be in somewhat a stage of preparation for, as they are plausible and they can happen. And I guess to answer your second question about data, it's been quite fascinating because, again, Latin America and the Caribbean is the region, right? So when you think about data from big agencies like IRENA or even the development banks, we're all grouped in. But when you take a closer look at what data is actually out there, most of the time the data that is out there and the country examples that are chosen are actually for these bigger countries within the region that tend to be more focused on Latin America than our smaller Caribbean islands that do have. So it has a sort of dichotomy in terms of the availability of data even within our small region. Yeah.
No, I think that's, I mean, you raised some really good points there. I think that anyone who's worked in the Caribbean is used to the Caribbean being there in name only sometimes, and just kind of grouped in with countries that it really doesn't have that much in common with in a lot of ways.
Right,
I mean,
outside of our geographical proximity,
right,
which is the tie. And that happens for, I guess, like other regions as well. But for islands, it's particularly interesting as we could be great laboratories if the data was actually out there for us to be able to test.
And I think this SIDS grouping, there is sometimes data available on the SIDS level. So IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, they will produce some level of data for example, grouping the Caribbean with Pacific and African islands like Mauritius and Cape Verde. So you do see those kind of comparisons really make more sense. And on your comment on resiliency, I just want to add, often the Caribbean is considered middle to high income. Many islands have quite middle income, and that can sometimes disguise the reality. We saw that with Dominica. Yes, Dominica might have had a higher income on average than some of the Latin American countries, but that entire GDP was wiped out overnight. And similar with Aruba, I mean, you could probably regard Aruba as one of the wealthiest countries in the region when you look at per capita GDP, and that wealth has disappeared in a matter of 2 months. So that's often an issue of frustration because funding available on international levels is often categorized according to GDP per capita, which there is a movement against now by pointing out that actually small economies are so fragile that funding should be made more available. One more question for you, Azel, and I think actually you could do a whole PhD on this if you wanted to. The question is, how easy would it be for Trinidad and Tobago to move into renewables? And maybe you could also mention the recent RFPs that have been issued by the government, because the government is starting to kind of venture into this area.
Yes. So I think that Trinidad and Tobago has great potential to move into the renewable energy space. And I think that you are seeing some progress or some work in that direction. The challenges before tended to be this idea that we were solely reliant on oil and gas, predominantly gas, and therefore why, if our electricity rates are among the lowest in the world, there was no momentum or push from a general populace because my electricity is cheap. Why do I need to look to renewables that would cost me more, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was, and that was because of our subsidies. But if we are to redirect that subsidy and remove, and there has been plans and slow progress with regards to the subsidy removal, you can see, I think that Trinidad and Tobago will eventually be in that renewable energy space and a mover and shaker.
Do you happen to know the tariffs that the consumer was paying, of the generation tariffs approximately?
I want to say at my last check, it was 4 cents per kilowatt hour, 4 US cents per kilowatt hour.
I think it was as low, I'm sure it was as low as 3 at one point. And this is completely anecdotal, but I remember staying in an Airbnb in Kingston in Jamaica, and the guest before me had been from Trinidad.
I
And
remember this
the Airbnb owner telling me how upset she was because the Trinis came in, turned the air conditioning on full blast, and left all the windows open. Yeah. Well, in Trinidad, it's so cheap that you don't have to think about that. But in Jamaica, the cost is over 10 times higher.
Right.
So
we have this huge opportunity cost, right? Because you're now also seeing this downstream gas shortage. So you have this opportunity here to, instead of using the gas for our electricity, which is so highly subsidized, and yes, we do take advantage of that, we can redirect that gas into our downstream industries and make a lot more.
Yeah, interesting. Trinidad is going to be a fascinating case study, even if it's perhaps not a model that's applicable anywhere else. It's really interesting to look at that. Gabi, back to you. We had a couple of questions about Puerto Rico, which I have now lost. Okay, so Peter Tierney asked about PREPA and the PREPA certification for solar products. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and the implications of COVID towards PREPA certifications.
Yes, well, when we were in the lockdown in March 15, PREPA was not working on the permitting process, neither the certification process. But now, starting this Monday, now they're starting to work. So for sure, there's going to be a backlog in permitting and in process. So for sure, it's affecting.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, and so I just kind of want to give all of you an opportunity for any extra points. I know you can see in the chat there's a few questions that we're not going to have time to answer all of them, but if there's any. But Dagmara, given what Azel and Gabi have just said, any extra kind of trends or comments that you'd like to make about renewables in the region?
Yeah, I think, I like the question that was posed that Azel answered. What are the chances of how can Trinidad and Tobago can move into renewables? And I think the answer to that is education, education, education. I came to Aruba back in 2012 when Mike Amon, the then Prime Minister of Aruba, I'm going to say, made Aruba the first Caribbean island to set definitive renewable goals. Very ambitious without fully knowledge of the technology and the cost that it entails. However, there it was. You have to, reach for the stars to get to the moon kind of thing. And I worked with the Prime Minister of Aruba, and one of the things we did with Bureau of Innovation and Sustainability is having a program on a national level, educating school children on sustainability, on renewables, on sustainable practice at homes, on solar, on wind, on inverter-based air conditioners. And it was a big program to undertake, maybe not as big as Trinidad and Tobago because that's much bigger. But the thing is, once those kids get their things, and this is every single high school on Aruba, get their things and teeth sunk into those issues on the project basis, they speak with their parents, and then you see this whole consciousness shift on the island. And I think that would be my advice.
So
or
maybe
how would you transition?
maybe the answer is more solar challenges like you ran in Guyana.
I wanted to put a plug, but I didn't let me mention solar challenges because James and I are both involved in the Solar Head of State. I've been working on the solar challenges there. The latest one we did, interestingly enough, was in Guyana, which is another locale in Caribbean that is going to be brimming, gushing with oil and whatnot. The thing is, our biggest sponsor there was the Guyana utility. So there is the recognition of the appreciation of the renewables despite the fact of the availability of the fossil fuel sources. So yes, Solar Challenge is a great initiative. I would love to, I don't want to take up the time, but I would love to find an opportunity maybe for Nico's platform to share about it so we can do more awareness initiatives more on all of the islands.
Absolutely, and I will say that Guyana is really interesting in the sense that although there is all this movement towards oil, the government is committed to a green growth strategy and has issued, although the politics is a little bit complicated now, but the government had a plan in to invest that money into a green growth strategy. So I'm going to just go back to Gabi and then to Azel, just a minute each for your final thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah, no, for me, I think it's super important, the aspect of resiliency. We are in the Caribbean, now hurricane season is going to start in a couple of days, so my understanding is all islands in the Caribbean need to be resilient. We cannot just wait for another hurricane to hit. They're coming stronger, they're coming bigger, and they're coming more constantly. So, and also, and then adding other natural disasters in the COVID. So we don't have to be hit by a natural disaster, something to respond. So here, I think it's going to be resilient, and also the importance of collaboration from different stakeholders. The government needs to get engaged, not-for-profits, private entities need to get engaged and support these types of projects in the Caribbean and elsewhere, of course.
Yeah, definitely. Azel?
I think that it's important that countries, rather than trying to focus on predicting what our future would look like, that we really try to strengthen our abilities to cope with this uncertainty. I think that strong leadership is needed at all levels, and that does include the education of our young people and the inclusion of them in decision-making processes. I think that the future and the resiliency of our islanders and the Caribbean people is strong, and I think that our clean energy future is definitely bright.
Fantastic. That's a nice note to end on, and I appreciate that. I think it's. I mean, we've obviously seen now how diverse the region is and how the approaches being taken are quite different. But I think it's really important what Gabi said, that we are entering into this hurricane season, and there's actually a lesson from the South Pacific, from Vanuatu, which about 2 weeks ago was hit by a cyclone, and actually made the decision not to accept aid workers because they were left in this position where they were COVID free and did not want to risk aid workers coming into the country that could actually transmit that again. And I think you have the added problem that obviously all countries are now focused on themselves, focused on responding problems at home. So traditionally, the Caribbean islands have been very good at supporting each other during a crisis. You know, you see often I think outside the region, the focus is on how the UK or Europe or US or Canada are coming in to help. But actually, a lot of the help comes from neighboring islands. The Caribbean islands really stand up for each other. They help each other in a time of crisis, because they know ultimately that that the hurricane could hit any island at any point. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that with this pandemic that we're also focused on, that the nature isn't stopping. And a hurricane is coming at some point. You know, we're all praying that this year, this year we'll have somewhat of a reprieve. But energy is a huge part of that with resiliency. Both Dominica and Puerto Rico were examples of the role that energy played, how that impacts healthcare, how that impacts transport and communications. So it's really a vital role to this idea of climate resiliency within the region. So thank you, Gabi, Azel, Dagmara. Really interesting talk. I know we could have talked for a lot longer if we wanted, and I'm looking forward, Azel, for your research to come out on all of these topics. Over to you, Nico.
Yeah, thank you, James. Thank you, esteemed panelists. This was a really intriguing conversation, one I've been looking forward to, not the least of which because of the deep level of professionalism that you all represent in your particular markets, in the way that you approach climate change, and the great support that you've given to these markets in one way or the other, whether it be renewables or research or creating platforms for others to stand on, as James and I have a chance to do from time to time. I can't believe I was hitting myself in the head. I didn't even mention James, Solar Head of State, which is exactly why you were a guest on Suncast about a year ago, to talk about how Solar Head of State as a nonprofit is also taking an amazing initiative to bring solar to, as the name implies, the heads of state, put it on the principal places of residence in these island nations around the world. The work that you all are doing is contributing in massive ways to the overall effect that we all want to see, which is that climate change is mitigated, that our carbon footprint is reduced, that our economies begin to move towards more sustainable and effective measures, and that our children have a place to call home that we enjoy and that looks somewhat like what we enjoyed in our childhood in some way. I wanted to, well, first and foremost, say thank you to you all as a group. We have a few announcements, so I'm going to invite you all to stick around. I'll chat with you in just a moment, but I want to take a second here and thank our sponsors who helped make this possible. Thank you all for joining us today. This is a free event for you to view because companies like SunGrow, Zia Shine Solar, and the many other logos you see here represented in our industry have contributed in some major way to either bring you here or to cover the cost of bringing you here. So we're grateful for them for their contribution, their help towards making this possible. We are going to have another session, our final, our penultimate actually, the panel session of the day that is going to start in about 10 minutes time. And that is all about energy storage. So we're going to have that panel starting in just a few minutes. And in the meantime, I just wanted to say once again that there are many ways you can engage with us in our community. That final panel, by the way, is going to be on storage, is going to be in Spanish, as will the final product showcase from Zia and Shine, all about their graphene coatings. So I want to make sure that you stick around for those. If you aren't registered and you're watching us here on one of the social media channels, whether that be Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter. We're grateful that you've joined us. Thank you for sticking around. Thank you for the comments and the questions. One last thought to that note. There were a number of questions unanswered, and this esteemed panel we can certainly, using these platforms, address them in the future. So keep your eyes peeled. Make sure you register suncastsummit.com so that when we do the follow-on session to this session to address all of the questions that went unanswered, you'll be sure to get it in your inbox as a replay. And last but not least, I wanted to encourage you all to join us in our Facebook group, the Clean Energy Guild. If you have not, you may join us over there on Facebook, Clean Energy Guild, where the conversation continues with our esteemed panelists and many other mentors, leaders, and participants across all levels of clean energy. The group is growing quite rapidly at this point. I think we're probably over a couple hundred now. And that we have a few giveaways going on inside the Facebook group. And of course, all the replays are also available in the Facebook group. So if registering and getting all the emails is not your thing, go to the Facebook group. You can catch all the videos there, and you can communicate and get to hang out with all of our panelists as well. So with that, I wanted to say thank you so much once again. We'll see you in our final session, which is all about energy storage. It is in Spanish, and then the product showcase for Z and Shine right after that. As we always say, you are what you listen to, and in many ways what you watch. So we thank you so much for your time and attention, the only resource that you can give and that we can't give back. Hope that you've learned something here today, and we really look forward to having you participate with us in future events. Thank you so much.